Okay, so that's a funny little image of the digestive tract with nothing else there, right? But starting up with the mouth, right, is where that starts. But yeah, so today the way we'll handle the digestive tract is kind of start up in the mouth and then work our way down. So today is kind of overview of the whole thing, but then mouth through the esophagus. Next class we'll get into the stomach and the small intestine. Then the class after that will be the large intestine, as well as some pathologies of the digestive tract. So yeah, so the GI tract, gastrointestinal tract, is just this one long continuous tube, right, going from the mouth all the way down to the anus. Um, and we kind of have some similarities throughout, no matter which part we're in, right? Anything that we get inside the digestive tract, starting in the esophagus, is considered outside of the body, right? We talked about this. So like when something is excreted into the digestive tract, that's considered outside the body. That's considered an exocrine excretion, right? The digestive tract is about 30 feet long. Okay, most of that's in the small intestine. We'll look at those in a sec. We'll look at the different portions in a second. One of the big features of the digestive tract, which we've seen in other places too, is surface area, right? So overall, if we take every little bit of surface area we have and lay it down flat, it's about the size of a football field, right? So just an incredible amount of surface area. This is obviously how we bring nutrients into our body, right? And why do we need to bring these nutrients in? Obviously, they form the structure of our body, all the functions, the energy production, really all cellular processes are based on having nutrients, having the supplies, kind of the materials that we need to build our cells, build our extracellular matrices, and to provide energy for those. So this will be the kind of the inside of the small intestine where we have these little bumps. We'll talk about those in a second. And that's how we get all the surface area. And the reason we want that surface area is so we can put a bunch of little enzymes all over those things, right? The more space we have to plug enzymes in, then the more functional space we have in the tract, and that's why we need so much surface area. So, okay. All right. So the processes that the digestive tract does, all the different processes of digestion are here. Okay. So the first one is ingestion, right? So that's just getting food into our body, right? Somehow getting it from the outside inside. That's ingestion. All right. So most of the time that's eating. Could also be different types of tubes that get food into our digestive tracts in cases where the person can't eat, right? Patients in hospitals sometimes need to just have food pumped directly into their stomach so they can get nutrients in when they're not conscious enough to eat themselves, right? So that's the ingestion process. Mechanical digestion is just smashing things together, right? So this is obviously chewing, but mixing of food by the tongue is important. Churning of food by the stomach. We'll see our stomach can really just contort itself in all kinds of different ways, and that serves a role to mix things up. And then we have a process called segmentation where we get food kind of going down the track really fast, and then we just put a wall up there and the food just hits that and kind of churns around in that area. That's segmentation. And then chemical digestion, right? Chemical digestion is, prepare food for enzymatic digestion there was on that for the function under mechanical digestion. And then chemical, we've got the breakdown of food particles into smaller particles, and this is prepared for absorption, right? So getting it actually into our bloodstream, out of our digestive tract into our bloodstream is the absorption. And this is always done with enzymes for the most part. Okay, we have a little bit of chemical digestion that happens with low pH in our stomach, but for the most part, most of our chemical digestion happens with enzymes. And so we have three primary classes of enzymes. So lipases are ones that help us with lipids. Zymogens are what are also called proteolytic enzymes, which means they break down protein. Zymogens are the inactivated form of those. Okay, and then we have amylases. Amylases break down carbohydrates. Okay, so lipases, zymogens, and amylases, three classes of proteins that help us break down things. First one breaks down lipids, second one breaks down proteins, third one breaks down carbohydrates. Okay, so we got ingestion, mechanical digestion, and chemical digestion here. And we got a couple other processes on the next slide, but yeah, so it's just in order, breaking down lipids, breaking down proteins, breaking down carbohydrates. That's all it is there on the bottom. Yeah, Andrew?
Isn't there before the food after it goes through like your mouth, like you just like the ball of it?
Say it one more time.
Isn't there like a term for like just like the ball of food?
Uh-huh. The bolus, yeah. The bolus is that, and we'll talk about that in a second when we talk about swallowing, because we're going to kind of put it into that bolus as we push it down into our esophagus. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions on this? Yeah, Abby? Yes, zymogen is the inactivated form of an enzyme that's going to break down proteins eventually once it gets activated. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Good. Other questions? Okay, so a couple more processes. We have propulsion, absorption, and defecation, right? So propulsion is going to be pushing food through the digestive tract, right? So moving it through. Okay. The one we'll talk about today is called deglutition. Deglutition is just swallowing. Okay, that's getting food from our mouth into our stomach. Okay, and then the one that happens all throughout, starting at the esophagus, all the way down to the rectum, is peristalsis. Okay, and so peristalsis utilizes the smooth muscle that lines our whole digestive tract, and it happens in a very organized and kind of rhythmic fashion to move food down, kind of like when you're trying to get your toothpaste from the back of the tube to the front. You squeeze it down, right? It's kind of, that's a very good way to think about it. That's what's happening, right? It's taking that food, that bolus, pushing it down in a very organized fashion to move that food through. Okay, then absorption is getting that food from the digestive tract into your blood. For the most part, in the case of fats or lipids, we put it into our lymphatic system first. We'll talk about that next class. And then lastly, defecation is eliminating it, right? Getting the stuff that we don't need, or that we can't process, the undigested things, and excreting them from the body. Okay, so we'll see in a sec that we've got some different layers of muscle in the digestive tract. And you can see here, the more outer layer is this longitudinal muscle, which is muscle kind of going in straight lines down along the tube. But then we also have circular muscle, which is this layer here, more on the inside. And those are muscle cells going circularly around the tube. And both of those are used for the peristalsis process in a coordinated fashion. Okay. Questions on that? Okay, so yeah, just take a sec with the people around you and fill in here by using this diagram, which parts of the digestive tract do we have? Ingestion, mechanical digestion, propulsion, chemical absorption, defecation. You're just writing in the kind of structure that you see there on the image. Okay, go ahead. Take a stab at that.
Oh, maybe it is. So good. Thank you. No. Yeah. I have a question.
Yeah. That's definitely happening. Yeah, some of that is happening then for sure. Yeah, it's kind of gurgling around, it's churning everything around. Yeah, for sure. Mhm.
If it's something to do, like, with these people, oh, somebody's.
It could be either, actually. Yeah, yeah. Because we have these, when you haven't eaten for like 3 hours, then you have these kind of rhythmic contractions that happen through your whole GI tract, just kind of keep stuff moving and make sure bacteria don't kind of like find a place to kind of like grow. And so that kind of keeps things moving too. So that can happen when your stomach is empty. But when your stomach's full, you also churn a bunch too. So it can be kind of either one. Yeah. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right, let's go ahead and come back together here. Okay, so we can just walk through this. So obviously ingestion is happening in the mouth, right? Mechanical digestion, we can see here, it's kind of all just listed there, right? So chewing in the mouth, churning around in the stomach, segmentation in the small intestine, like I was talking about. Propulsion has to happen all throughout, right? It's got to happen in the esophagus and in the mouth up here in the pharynx, right, in our throat. It's got to happen in the esophagus and the stomach and the small intestine and the large intestine, right? It's pretty much happening everywhere, right? Because we got to push the food through everywhere. So propulsion is just a part of the whole thing. Chemical digestion, the primary place this is happening is the small intestine. Okay. We're going to get some in the mouth. We'll talk about that in a sec. More next time. Some in the stomach, but mostly in the small intestine, right? That's the primary one. Is the small intestine. That's where most of all of our enzymes are. We do have some enzymes in our mouth that break down carbohydrates for us, salivary amylase, and then we do have the low pH of our stomach, as well as a couple enzymes that are released in the stomach to help us break down proteins. But then the vast majority of that chemical digestion occurs in the small intestine. And most of the enzymes for that come from the pancreas. Our pancreas makes most of those enzymes, dumps them into the small intestine. We'll talk about all that next class. Okay, and then absorption is also mostly the small intestine. Okay, pretty much all of our nutrients, carbs, proteins, fat, all of that's absorbed in the small intestine. Water gets absorbed all throughout. Certain drugs and chemicals, like alcohol, gets absorbed in the stomach, right? Ibuprofen gets absorbed in the stomach. So there's certain things, but as far as like the actual nutrients we need, that we think of, that's all the small intestine. And then obviously defecation is happening at the very bottom at the anus. So yeah, questions about any of that? Okay, so let's talk about kind of the anatomy of the GI tract and all the different layers. Okay, so the different layers are called the mucosa of the first layer is called the mucosa. Okay, so this is the most inner lining of the GI tract. Okay, and this is one of the forms of simple columnar epithelial tissue, like we talked about in BIO1040. Remember, so single layer of cells, column shaped, right? And then we have goblet cells between those. Those are the ones that secrete mucus. Oh, I don't know why that happened. Yeah, and then yeah, so the function there, the mucus is going to help to dissolve products, so then we can have enzymes interact with them to help break them down. Okay, and then we also have enteroendocrine cells here. Okay, enteroendocrine cells are cells that are endocrine, so that means they release things into the blood, right? And so instead of like the goblet cells release mucus into the GI tract, enteroendocrine cells release things the other direction into the blood, not in the GI tract. So it's part of our hormonal control of the GI tract is controlled by the cells that are right there. Okay, and so those cells are kind of sampling what's going through the GI tract, and then releasing the appropriate hormones to make sure the right types of digestion can happen. Okay, next we get to the next layer called the lamina propria. This is that loose areolar connective tissue. So this is where there's capillaries, blood vessels, other things being housed there. Okay, this is where we get the absorption of our nutrients as well as the transport of those hormones that are released. And then the next part of the mucosa is the muscularis mucosa, which is a very little, kind of very thin, smooth muscle layer that just kind of helps to wiggle around the inside of the smaller, or inside of the intestines to kind of dislodge chunks of food that got stuck in there. Okay, so that's our mucosa. Then we move on to the submucosa next. So the mucosa is the one the most internal, where the closest to where the food's going through. Now we're on the layer one external from that called the submucosa. This is dense irregular connective tissue. Okay. This is where those collagen fibers are going all different directions, right? So it can get stretched in all different directions. And there's lots of elastic fibers. Okay. So it can stretch out, but then it maintains its shape. It can bounce back elastically. This is where we house all of our blood vessels, nerves, lymph vessels. Okay. So why do we have blood vessels? This is how we digest all of these things, right? This is how we get these things, absorb them from the GI tract and send them to the rest of the body. Why do we have lymph vessels? This is the way that we absorb lipids. Okay. And then why do we have nerves? We have nerves because we need to control all of that smooth muscle all throughout the GI tract that's so kind of very delicately controlled and precisely controlled. And so these are a form of autonomic nerves, part of the autonomic nervous system. So this is all involuntarily controlled, right? We can't think about contracting our stomach muscles and do it, right? It's all kind of reflexively and autonomically controlled. Okay, so this whole submucosal layer has the stretchy elastic fibers, but then just a bunch of space there, that loose areolar connective tissue that houses all of these types of vessels and nerves. Okay. Questions on that one? Good, yeah. Andrew?
So the mucosal layer, they're most lining.
Yeah. Mhm. It just means that we have, that's the most kind of, that we'll talk about in a second, but we have the little papillae. We'll see them more in the small intestine notes, I guess, but all those little bumps that were in this first part here. We have a more pronounced section of that where these little bumps are sticking up, and then we just have a lot more enzymes for transport and things like that in that area. And it just happens to be the place where the nutrients are broken down enough to be absorbed. And so that's kind of why that's where all that happens. It's not necessarily that it's thinner, but it's just kind of like sequentially, that's when it makes sense. And then we have a lot more kind of enzymatic power there to break things down and then absorb them too.
So it's more like accessory tissue.
Yeah, more of the materials and stuff that we need to do the job of digestion and absorption there. It's the longest part of our GI tract as well. Yeah, good question. Yeah. Okay, so that's our submucosa, and then next we get to the next layer called after the submucosa is the muscularis externa. Okay, so this is all smooth muscle, right? And we've already kind of talked about this one a little bit. This is where we have the most inner layer is circular fibers. Right, so if this stylus is the tube going down, right, the circular fibers are going around it this way, right? So when they squeeze down, they can completely pinch it off, right? They can pinch off a section, right? But then the longitudinal fibers are going this direction down this way, right? And we can kind of contract those like the toothpaste tube, start with these ones first, and then the next ones, right? And that's how we get that peristaltic action. And then the stomach has an additional layer, which is kind of going diagonally, called the oblique layer. And that one is what allows the stomach to pretty much turn itself inside out, right? When we throw up, right? Our stomach pretty much turns itself inside out when we vomit, right? Able to just completely empty its contents up into the esophagus. The other parts of the intestines can't quite do that like the stomach can because it has that third layer of muscle. And then all throughout, we have little sphincters as well. And the sphincters are just thickenings of the smooth muscle that will divide one section of the tract from the next. So we'll see a couple up in the throat, at the top of the esophagus, one at the bottom of the esophagus, one at the bottom of the stomach before we get into the small intestine, another one at the end of the small intestine before we get into the large intestine. So these are just like little doors, little barriers to kind of divide one section from the next, and they can completely close and then open up when we want to send things through. So that's the muscle layer. Yeah, there we go. So the function of that is completely close the GI tract to prevent backflow. That's a big part of it. Right, once we've sent the food from the small intestine and the large intestine, we don't want that stuff to come back into the small intestine, partly because there's a lot of bacteria in the large intestine and not in the small intestine. And then we also just want to stop contents from going from one section to the next if we're still working on digesting those things or still working on absorbing those things. We don't want it just to pass through too quickly. So prevent backflow and to slow the movement through. Okay. And then we've got our last layer. The most external layer is called the serosa. Okay, and the serosa is another version of a serosal, a serous membrane. Okay, we talked about the serous membrane around our heart, the pericardium, talked about the serous membrane around our lungs. Right, we talked, and so there's another version of that. This is where we have the two layers and then some space in the middle with fluid and then another two layers, right? And so the one that's closer to the organs that we're protecting are called, always called the visceral side of that, right? So the visceral peritoneum is what lines the GI tract. Okay, and then we got some space in the middle, and then we get to the parietal one, and the parietal one lines the abdominal cavity. And the function of this whole thing is to protect and cut down on friction, because again, these are organs that move a lot, right? So they move around a lot. So we need a covering of it that can move freely and not be limited by movement, but also still provide a protective layer. Okay, and then we have the mesentery, which is all part of this peritoneum, and the function of this is what holds organs in place. Okay, and so you guys saw this when you dissected the cats, right? And you got into the abdominal cavity, right? There's all that kind of fatty tissue and the kind of like thin, almost like spider webby material that was holding all the organs together, and that's the mesentery. And so that's a housing for blood vessels and nerves. Yeah. It just says hold organs in place, pathway for nerves and blood vessels. The next slide is labeling all these layers, so feel free to hop over there and start doing that. I'll leave this up for a sec though, for those of you that are still writing.
So most animals is just going around. I thought it was the.
How hard is it?
Like, is it like really detailed?
It's tough. Yeah, yeah. You definitely need to.
Would you say it's like?
It tends to be a lower average score than all the other exams.
Do you think it's because it's actually harder, just because it's?
There's so much material. Yeah.
Okay.
It's just there's so much. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the average score typically on exams is around 78. This one's typically maybe like a 72. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
For this D2 one,
Yeah.
is this talking about like the nerves?
Yeah. That's one of the nerves.
Okay, and then what would D3 be then? Is that just the layer?
Because yeah, that is the layer of muscle, that most internal layer of muscle. Yeah. Mhm. All right, so make sure to send in your answer there, just a letter. That's the layer where nutrients are absorbed. All right, go ahead and send that in. Give you a few more seconds here, but let's go ahead and we can start walking through it. I'll leave it open so you can send that in. So let's go ahead and walk through. So A is going to be our most internal layer here, right? So A is going to be the mucosa. And then we have those three kind of sub layers within the mucosa, right? A1 is pointing to that little muscle layer, right? A2 is kind of pointing to that connective tissue layer. And then A3 is pointing to the very internal layer, right? So those three layers would be the muscularis mucosa, right? That's a little muscle layer. The lamina propria is that connective tissue layer. And then finally the epithelium, which was that simple columnar epithelial tissue. Right, if we zoomed in, we could see some little goblet cells in between those, right? So most of you put A for the answer here, which is correct. That most internal layer is where the nutrients are absorbed, okay? There's no B, huh? That's funny. I was looking for B next, but there's no B. Huh? Anybody else notice that? Yeah. Yeah. All right. So then C, we've got the submucosa, which is next. Okay. And then we've got all those little layers within, right? So we've got dense irregular connective tissue, right? Helps to stretch and bounce back. We've got nerves there, right? The submucosal plexus. That's just what that's, there's some nervous tissue there. We've got blood and lymphatic vessels that are also there. And then we've got some glands there too, like this, right? That's what's going to be releasing some mucus there as well. Okay, then we've got D. D is the muscle, the muscular layer, the muscularis externa. And we've got three different things there, really just two layers. But the longitudinal layer of muscle is the one on the outside, circular layer, the one on the inside. And then the two that has the one in the middle that has the two lines is just pointing to the nerves that are passing through there, the myenteric plexus, which is going to control all of those muscle layers. Okay, and then lastly, we've got the serosa, right? That's so that double layered membrane, serosal membrane that protects and lines the whole GI tract. Okay. Questions about any of that? I'll give you a sec to finish writing it down. Questions about any of these layers before we move on? Okay. All right, so couple more anatomy things. One would be the blood supply to the GI tract. The blood supply is known as a splanchnic circulation. Okay, this takes 25% of our cardiac output. Right, so lots and lots of blood goes to the GI tract. Okay, and that increases even more during meals and right after meals. Right, and the functions of this would be, first of all, to feed those cells of the GI tract that need a lot of energy, need a lot of nutrients and fuel to do their work. But then also, we got to absorb the nutrients into the blood and take those nutrients to other places in the body. So we need blood for that. Okay. Another unique part of this system is called the hepatic portal circulation. Okay. We talked about a portal circulation that we have up in the hypothalamus and pituitary gland as well, right? That usually means we have two capillary beds, right? That first capillary bed is always for dropping off nutrients. We have fully oxygenated blood there. Then we go to a vein, and then we go to another capillary bed before we get back to the heart, right? Which is unique. It's usually just one capillary bed. So that second capillary bed is going to be, for the first one is picking up the nutrients that we absorb there in the GI tract, and then we take those nutrients and drop them off at the liver. Okay, and that's what the portal vein does. The portal vein drops off everything at the liver. That's where we process all of our nutrients. And so that second capillary bed's in the liver for dropping off nutrients there. Yeah. Okay. All right. And then the nervous system here, the controls the GI tract, is quite unique. It's actually has all the components of a full nervous system. It has motor neurons, sensory neurons, and interneurons as well. So it has all three types of neurons. And so it actually can pretty much function on its own. It doesn't have to be controlled by our central nervous system. We can control it with our central nervous system, but it pretty much functions on its own, coordinates all the activity of the GI tract, makes sure food is moving through. You don't need to know any of those details or those nerve names or anything, but just knowing that it's the enteric nervous system is what you need to know. Okay, so let's start with the actual structures and work our way down. We'll start with the mouth, right? The oral cavity. Okay, so we've got these structures that you know all of them already. We've looked at them already, right? So we've got the lips, a striated muscle there that we can control, right? So it's skeletal muscle. This is obviously where sound is shaped. Tongue, we have two different types of muscle in the tongue. We have the extrinsic muscles that originate outside of the tongue. They help us to move our tongue kind of like around, up and down. And then we have intrinsic muscles that are just found in the tongue. They don't anchor themselves anywhere outside of the tongue. This is how we change the shape of our tongue, right? Fold it in half, make the little flower out of it that some of you guys can do, or tie something with your tongue. I don't know. Okay. Yeah. So those are the intrinsic muscles, right? And then we've got all those gustatory receptors that we already talked about. Right, and then we've got the palate. Okay, so this is the hard palate right here, right? The bony part, and then here, after the bone ends, we've got the soft palate, right? So the soft palate is right there. Okay, and then the little part that hangs down off of the soft palate is the uvula, right? That uvula, we'll see its function in a second, but it can block off the nasal cavity, right? As we're swallowing food and getting water and liquid in, so that stuff doesn't go up into the nasal cavity, and that's the function of that uvula. Okay, and then when we get to the throat, is the pharynx, right? So this whole area is called the pharynx here. And we've already looked at those different structures when we talked about the respiratory system, right? We had the nasopharynx, the part right by the nose, the oropharynx, right, the part right by the mouth, and then the laryngopharynx is the part down there by the larynx down here, right? So we've kind of done all those structures already. Okay, go ahead, listen. Yeah. Yeah, it's just kind of like knowing where these structures are, you know, on that image. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. Oh, sorry. There we go. I forgot about those two. That's what you're asking about. Yeah. I thought you were talking about this part here. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Function of those muscles, move the tongue. Function of those ones, change shape of the tongue. With this white background, it's hard for me to see where there's blanks. I don't remember all the time, but you guys can see it easier on your paper. Are there more, or is that the two? Okay. Thanks. Okay. All right. Got those. Okay, so then a couple special structures here in the mouth would be the salivary glands, okay? These are glands that are exocrine glands, right? They secrete into the GI tract, which is, in this case, is the mouth, right? We have two primary types of cells there. We have the serous cells. Serous cells release a very watery secretion that also contains enzymes, okay? And then we have the mucus cells that release a more of a thick, stringy mucus that doesn't have it, that's not there for enzymatic or digestive purposes, okay? Um, and so we secrete a lot of fluid from our salivary glands, somewhere around a liter to a liter and a half each day of fluid comes out of our salivary glands. Okay. And then these different types of cells are found in all the salivary glands, but they're controlled separately by different parts of our nervous system. Okay, so the serous cells are controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, two cranial nerves there, the facial nerve and the glossopharyngeal nerve control these. Okay, and when we have parasympathetic activation of our salivary glands, that's when we release the watery stuff that has all the enzymes for digestion. Okay, parasympathetic, housekeeping functions, digestion, right? But then when we're stressed out, we have sympathetic activation of these glands. That's when we use the mucus cells instead. And this is just making sure we don't lose as much fluid, right? The thick, stringy stuff doesn't get lost as quickly. So we're conserving fluid with the sympathetic activation. Okay. All right. And then obviously a key feature of our mouth is our teeth, right? This kind of has the anatomy here. You guys have looked at the jaw anatomy back last semester. The tooth itself, the top visible part is called the crown. The middle part in the middle, kind of within the gums, is called the neck. And then the very bottom part is called the root. Okay. And so that root is the part that's embedded in the bone of the jaw. Yeah. And so then the tooth itself has kind of this outer layer, tough, hard, smooth outer layer called enamel, right? You guys are all familiar with your enamel. The inner bone-like portion is called dentin. Then the very center has connective tissue and blood vessels and nerves, right? And so when our teeth get too thin and get sensitive, right, because we're getting too close to where those nerves are, and we're breaking down the enamel. But then we have super strong ligaments that hold our teeth to our jaw and to the bone there, and also this special material called cementum that kind of holds everything in place there. Okay, so we can see all those structures here. A would be the top part, which is the crown, right? This is the part that we can see of our teeth, right? Working our way down is the neck. This is the part that's kind of in line with the gums. And then we get down to the root. The root is definitely the longest part for sure. Then the different layers of the tooth itself. So we can see the enamel on the outside. That middle part would be the dentin. And then in the very middle is the pulp. Right, so then in the pulp, we've got all the different nerves, blood vessels, all of those things. We can see those ligaments there. G would be the periodontal ligament, right? So lots and lots of ligaments that hold our teeth to the bone there. And then H would be that cementum material that kind of glues the teeth to the bony structure as well. And then I would just be the canal where all of those different blood vessels and nerves pass through. Okay. Is anybody pre-dental in here? Nobody. Okay, I was gonna say this is your day in class. We did the 1-2 thing, but nobody's pre-dental. So. Okay. All right. Questions about this at all? Okay, so then let's talk about moving from the mouth down to the esophagus. Okay, so the esophagus is what's connecting the bottom of our throat, right, our laryngopharynx down to the stomach. Okay, it completely collapses when it's empty. which we can't do that with the tube that's right next to it, right? With the larynx, we can't do that because we need air to always pass through there. So that's lined with cartilage. In this case, we don't have the cartilage lining here because we can let it completely flatten out when we don't have food passing through it because we, don't need to get air through there. Okay. It has kind of three different parts to it. The upper 1/3 of it is all voluntarily controlled skeletal muscle, striated muscle, right? The middle 1/3 of it is kind of half and half smooth muscle, half striated, and then the bottom part is all smooth muscle. Okay, so what that means is just kind of what I've already been saying, that the top part is all voluntarily controlled, right? We can think about it and contract it. The middle part is kind of half and half, and then the bottom part we can't voluntarily contract it at all. It's all just automatically controlled. Okay, one thing that can happen, we have this esophageal hiatus. This is the place where the esophagus has to pass through the diaphragm. Okay, so you guys saw this in the cats probably when you were doing the dissection. That esophagus passes right through the diaphragm. There's a hole there for it to do so. Okay, the one clinical application is when people have something called a hiatal hernia. Hiatal hernia is when the stomach actually shifts upwards. The diaphragm is supposed to be hitting right here on those two spots, but it's kind of shifted upwards. And normally the diaphragm is actually helping to serve as part of the sphincter to keep things down in the stomach and not let them pass back up into the esophagus. And so when the stomach shifts upwards like that, then you don't have the help of the diaphragm anymore. You're most likely to have GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, things moving back up into the esophagus, and it's really uncomfortable. Okay, and so we have the gastroesophageal sphincter, also known as the cardiac sphincter. This is between the esophagus and the stomach. Yeah, so that's there. And this is just preventing backflow. That's all that popped up on the bottom. It says prevents backflow. Okay, so the diaphragm helps the gastroesophageal sphincter do its job when it's in the right spot, but that hiatal hernia shifts it up in a way where it can't really help it anymore. Okay. All right, so then we've got let's talk about the digestion that occurs within this part of the tract that we're talking about here. So the oral cavity, we have mechanical digestion happening here with our teeth, right? Chewing, smashing stuff up. But then we do have some chemical digestion as well. Chemical digestion occurs when we put food in our mouth. That activates our parasympathetic nervous system, activates the serous cells of those salivary glands, the ones we were just talking about. Those are the ones that release the enzymes and the liquidy, the more fluid-like salivation. That's what one of the enzymes in there is called salivary amylase. So it's an amylase, so it breaks down carbohydrates, salivary, coming from our salivary glands. Okay, so it helps to start breaking up our carbohydrates. So when you take something like white bread or even like a saltine cracker and put it in your mouth and just kind of let it sit there, you may notice that it starts to get sweet eventually, right? Because the salivary amylase is taking polysaccharides, breaking them down into some disaccharides, and disaccharides are sugars. That's what our taste buds sense as sweet, right? They may not be disaccharides when you first put them in your mouth, but salivary amylase breaks them down so they turn into disaccharides, and then it's sensed as a sweet sensation. Okay, questions on that at all? Okay, then we'll end with the swallowing process here. Okay, so swallowing kind of has these three main phases. We got our voluntary phase, our pharyngeal phase, and our esophageal phase. Okay, the way we'll do it is I'll just you have the steps there, the different things occurring. What I want you to do for a second is just using this as kind of your guide. Go through this image as well as this image and just kind of plug in what's happening, kind of match it up with the steps that you see here. Okay. And then on your clicker, you can kind of fill in the step number where each of these things is happening. Okay. Just filling that in on this last slide. But on your clicker, I want you to send in the number that would correspond to where that gastroesophageal sphincter needs to open. Okay. So you're plugging in the numbers from the previous slides to all of these to kind of just wrap your head around what's happening with each step. Okay. So using this as your guide, fill in both of these as well as this, and send that one there in on your clicker. Okay, go ahead. It's fun to see you playing violin, Morgan. That was awesome. I didn't know you played violin in chapel, right? Yeah, I saw you laugh before Easter, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I literally could play like all kinds of places.
You did?
whatever's asked
That's
me.
awesome. Yeah,
Like,
I had never.
stress, so.
Yeah, I didn't know that. So I saw you up there. I was like, wait, that's Morgan.
So like playing a concerto like a week from Friday.
Really?
They're interested in coming.
Where's that at?
It's at Crystal.
Okay.
It's like a concerto.
Okay. That's
So
very cool.
preparing
Yeah,
the whole year.
that's amazing. Send me the info on it. Yeah, cool. Awesome. That's very cool. I didn't know that was part of what you do.
Yep.
Find out.
Very
stuff,
cool.
and we Figured out housing, so it was like, it was not.
All right, guys, let's go ahead and get into this because we only got a couple minutes left. I'll leave the clicker thing open. So you're just sending in a number. Okay. It's got to be 1 through 5, one of those. So go ahead and send something in while we're starting to walk through this. So we're going to start with this very first phase. We're turning the food into a bolus, right? So smashing it together. This is the voluntary phase. The tongue pushes the food and the bolus posteriorly back towards the oropharynx, right? So pushing it back to the back of the throat. Okay. Second phase is that pharyngeal phase, which just means like in the throat. Okay. So the bolus enters the oropharynx, so the throat right behind the mouth. Soft palate moves upwards, right? You can see that right here. So we're blocking food from getting up into our nose, into our nasopharynx. Okay. And the epiglottis tips downwards here, as well as the larynx moves upwards to block our respiratory tract there. All right, so the food's not going there. All right, so this is all just kind of directing the food to go into the esophagus and not into our nose or into our larynx. Right. And then lastly, the esophageal phase. This is where we're opening up that upper esophageal sphincter. And then peristaltic waves move that bolus down the esophagus towards the stomach. Okay, so step 3 would be where we're opening up that upper esophageal sphincter, which is different than the gastroesophageal sphincter. Right? Upper esophageal sphincter is up in your throat, the very top of the esophagus. Okay, good here. I'll leave it up for just a sec. Okay, and then let's go to the last part here. So esophageal phase continued, right? So peristalsis moves it down, all the way down. And then we get to the bottom part there where we need to open up the gastroesophageal sphincter to get the food into the stomach. Okay, and that part's all uncovered there, so I don't have to uncover those. So when does the gastroesophageal sphincter open? Right, so we've got really that's the last step, right? That's when it's happening. Okay. When does the tongue push I can just fill all these in so you guys can kind of see this. Okay. All right. Then we've got 3, 2, 2. Yeah. And then we've got, yeah, when does the epiglottis seal off the larynx? That's all in the same spot too, right? That's all happening in the same time when the soft palate is doing that. And then peristalsis of the esophagus would be happening in both 4 and 5. Right. So yeah, just kind of, a way for you to process that. So, all right, guys, have a great rest of your day. We'll see you on Friday for the exam. Yeah. Do you want me to? Yes, I will then. Yeah, I'll do it. Bye. All right. See ya. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.